Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Sally, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm so pleased to introduce this virtual event with GAL BECKERMAN presenting his new book, The Quiet Before, on the unexpected origins of radical ideas. He will be joined in conversation tonight by SEWELL CHAN, and we want to thank you for joining us virtually this evening. Harvard Bookstore's virtual event series continues this winter, bringing our authors and their work to our community and our digital community. Find our event schedule at harvard.com/events, where you can also sign up for our email newsletter and shop our shelves from home. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question for our speakers at any time during the talk tonight, click on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen and we'll get through as many as time allows. This event also has auto-generated closed captioning available. Depending on the version of Zoom you're using, you may need to enable captions yourself by clicking on the closed caption button on your screen. You can disable the captions there as well. In the chat, I'll be posting a link to purchase The Quiet Before on harvard.com. Your purchases truly make events like tonight's possible and help ensure the future of a landmark independent bookstore. Thank you all for tuning in and purchasing books from Harvard Bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. And finally, as you have no doubt experienced in virtual gatherings, technical issues may arise. If they do, we'll do our best to resolve them as quickly as possible. Thank you for your patience and understanding. And now I'm delighted to introduce tonight's speakers. GAL BECKERMAN is a writer and editor at the New York Times Book Review and the author of When They Come For Us, We'll Be Gone, winner of the National Jewish Book Award and named Best Book of the Year by The New Yorker and The Washington Post. He has a PhD in medical studies from Columbia University and writes for many publications, including The New Republic and The Wall Street Journal. Joining him this evening is reporter SEWELL CHAN. Now working at the Texas Tribune, he was previously an editor and reporter for the Los Angeles Times and the New York Times. Together, they'll be discussing GAL's newest book, The Quiet Before, on the unexpected origins of radical ideas. This book is a search for those quiet, secluded spaces in which loud revolutions are begun. From correspondences that sparked the scientific revolution to the zines that gave voice to women's rage in the early 1990s, this book posits that our most defining social movements were created in closed, quiet networks that allowed a small group to incubate their ideas before broadcasting them widely. It also reveals what the new social media ecosystem lacks and offers a recipe for growing radical ideas again. We're so pleased to be hosting this event tonight. The digital podium is yours, GAL and SEWELL.
Hi, Sally. Thanks so much for that very kind introduction. I really appreciate it. When I was an undergraduate a quarter century ago, just a few steps away on Plimpton Street, Harvard Bookstore was really one of my great refuges. And so it is really wonderful to virtually reconnect with this wonderful establishment. I really also just want to thank the participants who've come tonight. GAL is really not only a friend, but an author I just truly respect. And it's really delightful that you would all make time on your Wednesday evenings to be here. So thank you, everyone. And welcome, GAL.
Thank you.
GAL, this book, which I have just only recently finished, is really a treasure. I'm someone who, of course, like many journalists and editors, reads a ton of nonfiction. It's very rare for me to encounter a book that is so hard to categorize. It's not easy. I'm wondering right now at this moment.
I'm going to take that as a compliment.
it is intended as such, because I don't know if it on the shelf at Harvard Bookstore right now. Look, in my view, the book is partly international history. It's partly kind of a intellectual history. It's kind of a sociology of ideas, and it's also, very biographical as well. And it's very rare that a book manages to do so many things, contain huge ideas with such illuminating characters, and itself kind of have a kind of meta idea, which I hope we'll talk about in a moment. But I mean, do you agree with me that it's kind of a genre?
Yeah, no, I generally talk about it as a weird book. I mean, and I think starting with the structure, I had this vision of doing a book that was an argument book, that definitely tried to have a point of view and make a point, but that I built to that argument through a series of stories, that I would take a reader through a sequence of stories, narratives, and that they kind of, through the kind of absorbing, what was happening in each of these chapters, starting historically, before the scientific revolution and going all the way to Black Lives Matter in 2020, that accumulation of narratives would sort of build the argument in their own mind. So I trust the reader a lot in this book to sort of to make their way. I'm holding their hand, but like kind of lightly, and sort of come to the conclusions that I've come to investigating these stories.
Well, the reader's trust is amply rewarded because I think, just for our audience to know, the book is structured as kind of a series of stories about time, people in a certain time and place. And what's really remarkable, Gal, is that you take us vividly from 17th century Enlightenment France or early Enlightenment France to really the events of 2020 in Minneapolis and New York. And you draw together past and present in such thoughtful ways. And of course, there's a middle chapter that Gal has called simply cyberspace, which I want to spend some time on in a moment. But Gal, first of all, tell me a little bit about tell us a little bit about the notion of a republic of letters. In reading about, the opening of your book, in France is just so compelling and introduced me really to a set of thinkers and social networks that I just hadn't learned enough, that I hadn't encountered or learned about before. Right. Tell us a little bit about this character Peresque and why you chose to focus on him.
Right. So that chapter takes place in the 1630s in France. We're talking about sort of just before the scientific revolution, just maybe right, the moment before the Enlightenment becomes like a glimmer in people's eyes. And the Republic of Letters was this fascinating institution, a subversive one in many ways, a group of a few hundred men spread out all over Europe, most of them, kind of upper class or connected to universities. And they, through letters, began to kind of investigate the natural world in ways that really hadn't been done before, and actually wasn't quite allowed then, because the church's doctrine about almost everything was still very much in charge. And something as simple as sort of the Earth's place in the universe was not to be questioned. And in fact, Galileo, who figures kind of in a cameo in that chapter, was being persecuted in a very real way by the church because he was writing books that question some of some of that doctrine, that dogma. But these characters, and Peresque was very much a hub of that network, were doing all kinds of interesting data collection and investigating the skies above them and geology and any number of they were true polymaths, and we're doing what they called natural philosophy. There wasn't really a concept as we think of as science, but they were kind of inching towards scientific method, the idea of observation, of verification, of testing out, whether they had done an experiment, they would do it again to make sure that it came out the same way. All of these things that we've now kind of understand as scientific method, and they were doing it together and communicating through letters.
Yeah, and tell us a little bit about the nature of ideas spreading through correspondence. I thought that was so fascinating. Right. We're in an age where I've turned off all my devices for the purpose of this book talk, but I'm certain that in an hour and a half when I resume, there'll be new Slack messages and new emails and maybe new iPhone messages, all of which are probably in the end not at all consequential. How did the thinkers of this time kind of use correspondence to kind of exchange and build on ideas?
Right. So I'm interested in each of these chapters in the medium that's being used. So in this particular chapter, it was letters and the kind of the features that letters have as a communications tool. And so a letter allows you to communicate in a lengthy way over time. You can really make an argument, establish a voice. And And this was important for these characters who were in the Republic of Letters, because there really was a sort of a community that they were forming, and also allowed them to do something that maybe would have gotten them in a lot of trouble, as I said, if they were doing it in the form of a book, which was sort of a loud public declaration. The letters had a kind of incremental quality. There was something iterative. You know, they were building knowledge over time, going back and forth. And to make it a little bit more concrete and sort of to draw on the chapter a bit, what I focus on in that chapter is Peiresc, who's our central character, decides that the thing that he wants to understand about the world is the correct size of the Mediterranean Sea. He's sure, and all the sailors who have sailed the sea tell him that the maps which they're using, which are like 1500 years old, cannot possibly be right. But the only way to do that is to have an accurate picture of longitude. Latitude was pretty easy to figure out. You could just measure the sun, the noonday sun, using a quadrant. But in order to figure out longitude, the only way to really do it was to have people spread out in different geographical locations, all observing the same celestial phenomena the same night, and then marking the difference in time in which they saw it. And the difference in time would indicate the difference in longitude. So this sounds pretty simple, but it's not in the 1630s, because, you know, crowdsourcing this kind of information involves letters, and not just that it involves letters, but it involves people who are spread out all over the known world. So in Syria, in Quebec, in Tripoli, and most of the people who are in those places are men of the cloth. They're religious people, who missionaries and other kind of clerics who are spread out by the church in different parts of the world. And Peiresk's job, and this is where the letters become so essential, is to sort of recruit them, not just to this project, but to a completely different frame of mind, to thinking that there is truth that they can sort of create, elicit by virtue of their own eyes, by virtue of observation, which was a completely new concept for these men, and seemed dangerous, because one of the greatest men of their time, Galileo, is being put in house arrest for doing so. So the letters were sort of this, like, you know, they sort of greased the wheels of this process, because you and I was able to, all these letters have been, and there's thousands and thousands of them. Peiresc, amazingly, you know, didn't leave a book behind, but he left about 100,000 pieces of paper, and and the French National Library has digitized all of them, so you can actually go through and read his letters. So I was able to do so, and you see this beautiful, like, process that's taking place over about a year with each of these men. There's about 2 or 3 dozen of them, and he's kind of slowly bringing them on board, not just convincing them to take part, but also teaching them how to think like scientists. You know, how do they need to hold their body? What angle should the telescope be? You know, how should they take a correct and precise measurement? Why is it important to take a precise measurement? All of this is sort of this new thinking that he's inculcating them, you know, through the letters.
Moving on from this kind of pre-Enlightenment era, you know, you next take us to 19th century Britain,
Right.
where, you know, in the throes of kind of industrialization and kind of modernization, you know, the vote was still astonishingly limited to you know, men of property. You went really well into the 19th century. Could you tell us a little bit about the characters in that chapter?
Sure. So that chapter is about Chartism, which was a movement that was built. Again, you know, I'm focusing on a medium there, and there it's petitions. So Chartism took place it was a movement that began in the 1830s among the working class in England, who is, you know, as you said, didn't really have the right to vote. Only about 1 in 6 men, and nobody was even kind of talking about women yet, you know, had the right to vote. So these were people who were living in pretty horrid they had pretty horrid living conditions as industrialization increased, but had absolutely zero political representation, zero recourse, no way to sort of put in place laws that might improve their lives. And so what they decided to do was to use a petition. A petition was like this one little loophole in British law. It had been established in the 14th century that any British citizen could petition the king and the parliament for a grievance, but it had only ever really been used, you know, for small land disputes, and, you know, nobody had ever thought to use it quite at this scale. But the logic of the movement, and its leader was a man named Fergus O'Connor, who was this very charismatic Irish Irish character, Irish politician, radical politician who traveled the country sort of recruiting people to this cause. The logic of it was, let's get as many people as we can onto this petition and deliver it to Parliament demanding the right to vote. And in 1839, they managed to get over 1.25 million people. But what I look at in the chapter, what's interesting to me about this story is the way that the petition sort of allowed this movement, this idea of a working class as a distinct constituency to cohere, because they didn't think of themselves that way. They thought of themselves as just like angry people. And the petition actually being part of that process allowed them to see themselves as a class.
Now, let's be clear, this was not like a change.org petition.
No. It was very hard work. I mean, that's the other thing that's clear in this chapter is there is a distinction between the sort of slacktivism that we associate with just like clicking on something and the work of this petition, which, meant going door. The whole sort of world spun out from this act of trying to get people to sign it. There were associations that built up in local communities. People had to sneak onto factory floors and go door to door. And there were moments where like the numbers were lagging. And so they would kind of redouble their efforts and also convincing people. What I think is interesting about a petition of this sort, and we actually see it today sometimes when people need to do petitions, real life petitions, is it creates these like sites of conversation and intimacy, in the public sphere of, I need to come up to you and I need to convince you, to sign on to something. And then maybe we have a conversation about it. It's different than the declaration that we see on social media, which is just me sort of yelling out my point of view.
Now, from these starting points, early scientific revolution in France, the expansion of the franchise with the Chartist movement in Britain, you then move on to the 20th century and you bring us, just because I wish we could spend time with each chapter, but you bring us to Italy in the early 20th century with the emergence of the futurism movement. Mm-hmm. You take us to West Africa, to British Ghana, and the emergence of kind of an anti-colonial or anti-imperialist press. Mm-hmm. You take us to Moscow during the height of the kind of Brezhnev era, mm-hmm. When Soviet dissidents exchange and thinkers, exchange samizdat, publications. And then finally, before the interlude, you take us to DC and to the world of the zines from the early 90s, which I'm certainly old enough to remember, and how distinctive and voicey those were, in that kind of brief moment in hindsight before the era of blogs and Substack and now all that. How did you choose, Gal, these kind of seminal moments and episodes? How did you choose the range of ideas they represented, politically and otherwise? How did you choose the characters and the places that span these chapters?
So that was, if I have to say, the hardest part of this book was sort of casting that first half, because there were a few different factors. First of all, I wanted to tell stories that maybe people were not going to be as familiar with. People have asked me, why didn't you do French Revolution or American Revolution? And we kind of know the role of pamphlets, let's say, or the Committee of Correspondence, So I wanted to do something where people would be surprised by stories they hadn't heard before. The other thing I wanted to do was to tell stories. I endeavor in my writing to sort of borrow the best features of fiction, where, I wanted every chapter to have, strong characters, a plot, a narrative arc, where as a reader, you're sort of really following a story and not just sort of taking in information. So all of those things sort of created barriers for me in terms of the kind of, episodes that I could focus on. And I just started to kind of cast about through history. In some cases with Peiresc, for example, that was a footnote in another, in a book that I had read, and it had mentioned this aristocrat who conducted this experiment using letters. And I thought, wow, there has to be more here, and I found the one expert on Peiresc, and sort of drilled in there. In other chapters, like the one in West Africa, that was sort of a reverse engineering. And I did this a lot where I thought, here's this movement that I know emerged and had a huge impact on the world. right? So in that case, the anti-colonialism, decolonialism, and the emergence of independent African states. And I thought there must be a place. There must be a place where people who were part of those independence movements sort of gathered and began to imagine what it would be like to be independent, free citizens of their own countries, beyond notions of tribe or their kind of sublimated, colonial status as subjects. That must have happened somewhere, and again, it was just a lot of sort of digging and casting about and talking to experts. And finally, I landed on these small African-owned newspapers that were fascinating once I kind of opened that box, because you just heard voices, because most of these newspapers were not like newspapers, that you and I have worked at, where it's like there's a professional class of journalists who go out and collect information. They were almost all like one giant op-ed page. They were, the one I looked at had the bulk of it was called Grumbler's Row. And it was just people like, writing in to complain about this or that and argue with each other. And some of the work that was happening there was, this kind of building to a national identity, and really duking it out in terms of what is this going to look like, so I kind of got to that backwards in a way. Like I knew I wanted to tell the story somehow of a story in Africa and a story. So diversity was important to me, geographically, in terms of the sort of people I was focusing on. Historically, I wanted to sort of have a spread. And for every one of those chapters, there's like 5 or 6 that I researched that I had to, then not do, because it was too much, and or any one of those factors was just not there.
Oh man, I wish I could see that discard list, because that would itself be very interesting. So the first half of your book, Galt, kind of takes us into what you might call kind of the public sphere, right? The spaces that were created, even among dissidents, even among, teenagers putting together kind of scrappy, personalized magazines,
Right.
even among, people with limited resources, putting together, the first national newspapers in West Africa. But then your book, before you take us to the present, and you have this interlude about cyberspace, and I wanted to ask you why you structured it that way, and whether you kind of believe the internet has in some fundamental way kind of changed the nature, or at least the expression, of human consciousness.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it was important for me to have that, like, I saw it as a pivot, right? It was a pivot from this sort of world before, where we have all these analog ways of communicating with each other that are more interactive than we sometimes remember. I think that was the other thing I was trying to do with this book. It seems to me there's a kind of amnesia that, we think that before the internet came around, there was no way that people could have exchange and conversations through writing. And so I wanted to show examples of that happening. So I wanted kind of a pivot from that into the world that we inhabit today, in which there's these great big platforms that our public sphere, for better or worse, kind of takes place on. And that pivot made sense to look at something like the Well, which is what I focused on, which was this very early, there's not even the internet yet. This is like a modem that you dial into, and it's like a message board.
Yeah.
But it was in the mid 80s, it was the first time that people kind of came together and had like online chat.
This is even pre-AOL, pre-CompuServe.
Pre-AOL. In fact, Stephen Case, who kind of started AOL, kind of got a lot of his ideas from hanging out on the Well, and it was based in the Bay Area, near San Francisco, and it was all these kind of kooky characters. There was probably no more than like 2,000 or 3,000 people who were part of this. And they were the first people to kind of do what we do every day now. But what was fascinating to me about that as an example was 2 things. One was the sort of romanticism that immediately sort of kicked in about what they were doing, that they felt like this was, most of the folks who were involved, kind of who organized the Well, were actually like hippies. They had been, living on communes in the 70s. And so they saw this new space, they saw cyberspace as this kind of new sort of frontier for them to build the sorts of ideal communities that they wanted to build. And I think we've sort of still have that, a little bit of that idealized kind of romantic idea about what the internet could be. But then there's something else, which is almost right away, like within, months of them starting up, they realized that the only way for this to work in any kind of productive way is to be very, very self-conscious about, keeping the conversation productive and, putting guardrails up, having moderators, even taking breaks from being online and trying to meet in person so that it wasn't just like a virtual experience. There was so much effort that they put into, there was a whole nother section of this well where they would just talk about the conversations and make sure that everyone was sort of keeping it real, and not fighting each other too much. And if there were fights, people would intervene. It was just, it was clear to them. I mean, there was a troll. They had like a troll early on, like day 2, there's a troll, right? So like there's something that's very clear about this kind of disembodied kind of digital conversation has real dangers. And they knew that and sort of counterbalanced it. And the reason that kind of I emerged from that chapter saying that, unfortunately, what we've sort of kept is the romanticism of what it could be. Eric Schmidt, who was the CEO of Google, like even he talks about the well as this kind of that was the first place, that we first dreamed this dream of what the internet could be. But we forgot about the guardrails. We forgot about how hard it is to actually make that like a productive conversation. And from there, I mean, of course, we all know like everything spun through the enormous scale and commodification, and these spaces stopped being spaces where people were sort of trying to work towards that the bias of them was to move people towards productive conversation, but it was the bias became, how do we keep people on here as long as possible? And that creates an entirely different kind of incentive structure in terms of like what you're doing there, what type of talk you're having.
Well, Gal, that really takes us to the second half of your book, which I'm sad to say does a bit of a tonal shift, right? As your lens moves ever increasingly toward the present moment, the kind of dashed hopes of so much of recent history really become clear. For example, the Arab Spring, and right before that, Occupy Wall Street. You talk a little bit about the desperate spread of the desperate attempt of scientists to keep ahead of COVID in the face of so much misinformation and really obstruction from the government. You talk about, the spread of hate as exemplified in Charlottesville. You talk about both the emancipatory potential of the Black Lives Matter movement, but also the real difficulty its organizers have faced in kind of sustaining and growing that movement. And of course, sadly, we are all seeing, I believe, a great backlash to that movement right now. Whether exaggerated or real, I think there is kind of a backlash going on, or at least there's a rhetoric of backlash, which I'd like to hear more about. But what unites these kind of chapters that really, the kind of 21st century chapters of your book is kind of a sense, in my view, that the internet has been liberating in some ways, but has really entrapped us in other ways. And I kept thinking, like, what would Michel Foucault have thought of these chapters? Like that in many ways, the platforms have enabled a degree of connectivity and kind of, yes, the ability to spread ideas very, very quickly. But they've also really in many ways confined and channeled those ideas and in a way prevented them from leading to real political or social reform. Mm-hmm. Do you agree with that kind of characterization?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I was really inspired by, some of the media theorists of the 60s and 70s. Marshall McLuhan is probably the one who we think about the most. And the medium is the message idea, and it's that whole sort of generation and the set of ideas that they came up with has become a little bit, people see it as a little bit dusty now, that it's sort of that it's too much technological determinism, too much placing power in the in the idea that the medium itself can actually affect things, but and I think that there's a lot of value in kind of going back to the essence of what they were saying. And there's a few other thinkers. Neil Postman is another one who I really like. Who extended this to television, kind of televisual versus print culture. but the idea being that, whatever medium we use opens up certain kinds of conversations, and it forecloses other kinds of conversations. And as a result, sort of allows us to think in certain ways and closes down other avenues of thought. And we now have a public sphere on these large platforms that are very performative, are very loud, are very quick, don't really give a lot of room for focus and concentration and intimacy. They are bullhorns, essentially. And a bullhorn can be an incredibly effective tool for an activist, right? And it can call everybody to the square, in no time. And I would never sort of poo-poo, the power of that, and the fact that it has given people who didn't have that power, didn't have those bullhorns, it's placed it in their hands. And that is undoubtedly important. The difficulty, I think, is when that becomes the dominant tool and even the only tool. And when activists begin to think that all they need is the bullhorn, because the bullhorn is so effective in doing what it's supposed to do. And when you sort of begin to believe that, then you are denying yourself the opportunities to have these deeper, more strategic, more thoughtful, longer term kind of organizing conversations and gatherings that need a completely different form of communication to exist on.
I'm also really struck by how, these tools and platforms can be wielded in such similar manners by people who are so dissimilar. Yeah. They can be used to rally people in support of toppling a dictator. They can also be used to rally people in support of an ethno-nationalist agenda, as the Charlottesville, torchbearers, et cetera, did in 2017. These tools and platforms can be used, for racial justice, summoning people in communities across America, most of them overwhelmingly white, in an astonishingly moving and kind of clarion call, for paying attention to the effects of police brutality and institutional racism. But of course, these tools can also be used by, climate deniers and, COVID conspiracists and all manner of hoaxsters and troublemakers. And when you talk to the platforms, Gal, and all of us have as journalists, for many years, there was kind of a throw up your hands. Well, we're just the platform, don't blame us. Don't shoot the messenger.
Right.
Now, there's clearly a huge backlash against that right now. And I'm wondering, how do we solve that problem? Look, one man's freedom, we always say in journalism, one man's freedom struggle is another person's terrorism. The Ottawa truckers believe that they are an underheard, neglected, powerless minority who've been able to mobilize, in support of what they want, lifting mask and vaccine mandates, what have you. People gathering, in support of Black Lives Matter feel that they are also powerless, vulnerable minorities using these platforms to make their points heard. Is there a way to be not neutral, but how can and should platforms and our broader society react to this, profusion of fragmented messaging across all these platforms?
Yeah. Well, I think the platforms are a tool, right? And the tool as a tool is neutral. Anybody can use it for the purposes that bullhorn. The message coming out of a bullhorn is dependent on who's picking up the bullhorn, who's speaking through it. The problem that I saw is that if, as I want to suggest in this book, we should value a different sort of form of communication, a different sort of space, to use sort of an abstract word, a different gathering spot, then we can't just, I think that one of the things we do as a society, and I've seen this in the last 10 or 15 years, is that we assume that the people who value seclusion, who are valuing, huddling together in a corner and whispering amongst themselves, are up to no good, that they are that's where child pornographers go, and that's where ISIS recruiters hang out, and that's certainly where the Charlottesville, white supremacists are, what they're doing.
Dark web, 8chan.
Exactly. And that,
Yeah.
so one of the things I'm trying to do in this book is to say that we need to stop doing that, because yes, for sure, just like, the bullhorn is neutral, those spaces are neutral too. But if we just demonize them and imagine that they are only where the evil forces in society hang out, or the retrograde forces or reactionary forces hang out, then we're actually denying the opportunity for the more progressive forces among us to use those same spaces. And I can tell you just from perusing history that those are the spaces where those radical ideas, the ones that we all feel, or not all of us clearly, but you and I feel good about as indicating progress, that's where they start. And so, I had this kind of weird moment where I was, I have a chapter about those Charlottesville white supremacists where I spent a really fabulous few weeks just reading through all of their messages in one particular chat room that I got access to. It was a closed room, it was a closed space, and these hackers had broken in. And so I was able to really listen for like a few months leading up to Charlottesville. And it was extremely instructive in terms of what that sort of space, not the big performative yelling through bullhorns, but we're just gathering here amongst ourselves around a table, figuring this out space looks like. And I had this weird sensation thinking, I wish the Black Lives Matter activists had something like this. Like, I wish they actually, had a dedicated chat room among these amazing organizers that I got to know, where they could hash out, defund the police or abolish the police as a slogan. Does that make the most sense? Is there some other way that we can sort of put this?
And for certain that there wasn't like kind of a Facebook group that had,
I can't say for certain that there wasn't, but I know that, and certainly the evolution that I saw in that movement, because I really tracked it from the kind of early iterations of Black Lives Matter in 2015, 16 to 2020, they learned a lot in terms of kind of what they could expect the big platforms to give them, what the bullhorn could do and what it couldn't do. And so certainly, a group like Black Visions in Minneapolis that I spent time with, they are talking to each other on a Signal group, where it's just like the 15 kind of main folks in their group, who then are going out almost in a cellular type of structure, and meeting with other people. And they really got the value of not being so hooked on just getting the attention, becoming they all told me, in 2015, 16, there'd been tons of newspaper articles that would kind of list the top activists in the country by Twitter followers. So imagine you're somebody who's just sort of organizing at a local level, and you want to get like people elected to your city council who can actually put in place some of the police reforms that you want to see. And you see that it's like your allegiance is torn in terms of where you should be spending your energy and your time. Yeah.
So has social media made it harder for social movements to gather? Has social media made it harder even for us to think clearly and deeply? Great ideas take time to germinate. And in many ways, we're kind of at the cusp of the kind of new consciousness. We won't really know what this moment means until we're well into it, right? Decades. There's still too many people like you and me that who remember our pre-digital lives with longing and nostalgia in my case. But but there soon, of course, there will come a day when no one has a kind of pre-digital memory. And I'm just wondering if the kinds of impactful, revolutions of thought and habit and mind, are those becoming impossible because of these, shackles of the tools and the platforms?
I hope not. I think one of the things that makes me a little bit hopeful, actually, because I'm just incorrigibly like looking for those rays of light. I mean, I have small kids who, are whose brains are being, possessed by this technology, is that when it comes to other realms of our communal life, when it comes to our personal lives, when it comes to even thinking about democracy and democratic institutions, we've become quite savvy about understanding the limits of social media and what it can do for us and the ways that it works against us. I mean, I think that's certainly true for most people that I know when it comes to personal lives. Nobody mistakes a friend on Facebook as being a friend in real life, you know? And I think that's only increasing, the sense that these are private companies with their sort of capitalist interests that are sort of pushing us in certain directions and manipulating us in other ways. And it's true also for, you know, when we think about the way that society has been, you know, political society has become so much more divided, and outrage has sort of been exacerbated by the platforms. So all of that, I think, is hopeful in that kind of chipping away at what I think is one of the last remaining pieces of romanticism that we have about the internet, which is that it somehow, you know, all you need is a hashtag gone viral to really make change in the world. You know, I think that persists, that feeling persists in spite of the fact that we have sort of grown a lot more self-aware and self-conscious in other ways. But, you know, I think young people actually are in some ways, you know, getting really savvy about this stuff. They really do understand like the differences in sort of what one, and almost intuitively, you know, like what being on Twitter allows you to do, and what being on Facebook allows you to do, and what being on Instagram allows you to do. And they get it in ways that I think us, you know, now the soon old people are still kind of bedazzled by it all, you know, like, so yeah.
Yeah, I got to create my TikTok soon. Well, some questions from our friends gathered here tonight. Was there anything you came across in your research for this book that surprised you or changed your preconceptions about revolutions or radicalism or social media?
You know, I think I went into this book sort of kind of an incrementalist, and then I understood that you know, just from from personality or whatever, you know, that change happens in a slow way, you know, that it always is something that takes a lot of time. But doing this sort of historical work and sort of tracking these movements over time, I felt it even more. You know, I think I really, you know, almost nothing that I looked at that indicated progress to me in society came without that kind of 3 steps forward, 2 steps back dynamic. And you know, at some level that's depressing, right? Because you just like, you know, why should it always be so hard? But I actually kind of was heartened by the notion that like, we need to just accept that as part of the way change happens. And when we do, we'll be less hooked on the idea that all you need is like a viral moment. We'll understand those moments in a context. We'll understand something like that summer of 2020 in a context of change having this much longer being a much longer process. And so I'm not sure, I don't know if it's something that I learned, but it's definitely a sensitivity and a sensibility that has sort of emerged from this project, just sort of appreciating the slowness of change and not being depressed by that, but actually thinking that it'd be good if everybody sort of really understood that idea.
Yeah, that's really, really powerful. I completely agree. Obviously, 2020 was a hotbed for these types of ideas moving into action. Do you have any inklings about how and or what the conditions were to produce such an absolute collision of all these ideas unloading at the same time in 2020? And I'm not sure which idea, but I'm assuming that part of it is obviously going to be racial justice. Part of it's going to be the response to COVID. Part of it, the response to the economic meltdown. Perhaps climate as well. Just trying to provide a little bit more framing around that question.
Yeah. I mean, I can take stabs like everybody. You know, I think that there was obviously COVID played a big part of it. The fact that everyone's sort of at home and was able to take to the streets. You know, when that moment arose, there was a lot of, you know, a sense also that the people that were being disproportionately affected by COVID were poor people of color, you know, in this country. And so that was a factor, you know, I think for Black Lives Matter, for this idea of, you know, police brutality and the kind of persistence of it. This came at the, you know, after many years of, you know, us sort of building awareness over time. You know, the George Floyd video was obviously, there was something so incredibly unambiguous about what was going on there, that had an incredible emotional resonance. So all that kind of was a powder keg, sort of perfect storm, whatever metaphor you want to use, where I think it pushed people out into the streets. But interestingly, I had gotten, by that point, because I had written a version of the Black Lives Matter chapter that I had finished in the winter of 2019, and it was kind of an elegiac, people in the movement looking back at 2015, 16, and then feeling like when they were so dependent on social media and so dependent on these highs, sadly, these highs of dramatic videos that would sort of grab attention, and then it would fade to be another video would grab attention. And they never really figured out how to sort of move beyond that. And then Donald Trump came around in 2016, kind of sucked all the oxygen out of social media. And by 2020, we weren't really talking about Black Lives Matter anymore. It persisted as sort of a memory of this moment. Then the summer happened, and I had to kind of tear up that chapter and rewrite it again. But what was interesting was that I was in touch with all these folks, and they experienced that summer in a very different way than you would think. On the one hand, of course, it was exciting, exhilarating that the entire nation was sort of turning its attention towards their cause, and some of these symbolic wins that they saw happening were thrilling, but they also were incredibly anxious, because they felt that they saw it again. It was this wave. Now it was an even bigger wave. It was about to sort of crash, and then what would come after? And it would just be disappointment and people feeling like they had, expended so much energy. And so the anxiety they felt was, how do we take that moment and translate it into concrete, action, in our communities, get that DA elected who we think should be elected. How do we sort of move that into the organizing work?
Yeah, that's really profound. Our next question, you mentioned slacktivism, Gal, earlier this evening. Would you be able to define that for us? And how do we avoid it, even in quiet activism?
I think, slacktivism, I don't even know, it's kind of an old term now, I think. I don't know if people use it so much anymore, but it was this idea that there were a lot of these sort of movements online that people would do, like the ice bucket challenge, or these kind of memes that would spread, that, the work involved in actually showing your solidarity or support, like putting up a black, just a black, blacking out your Instagram to show your support for Black Lives Matter or something, that it was so superficial. And so that's kind of what slacktivism was. I don't know. I think that I have a more nuanced sense of this, maybe. There's nothing wrong with, loudly declaring your allegiance to an idea or a cause, and sort of using your little individual megaphone to do it. It can really affect conversation. It can kind of turn everybody's direction one way, and there's nothing wrong with that. What I want people to avoid, to the extent that I'm offering, recommendations here, is to think that that's the work of activism, because it actually is the ease of it sort of undermines what really needs to happen, which is sort of a building sense of solidarity and community and coming together with people and putting in the work. Those petitions that we talked about in the 1830s, or even the petitions that Black Lives Matter activists had to walk around Minneapolis because they wanted to get a referendum, in front of voters asking whether or not the police should be reformed. That work of actually going door to door, talking to people, that the time, the energy, that's kind of where you can really have productive stuff, come out of that.
And do you sometimes feel that, was it Postman who wrote about entertaining ourselves or amusing ourselves to death? Do you worry that, the current information system is so filled with distraction, consumerism, mindlessness, that it takes away the mental space that would be necessary to do that slow and painstaking work of, rebuilding our democracy?
Yeah, I mean, I think it does. I think it does in the way that I worry that my kids don't read enough, and that, like, you know, that you know, that by not reading, they're losing that muscle that allows you to sort of focus and pay attention to a story over a long period of time, and that is something that's useful not just to become lifelong readers, but to do anything of value. You know, that but I don't want to also say that, like, the only solution is to unplug the internet, because, like, that's, first of all, that's not happening, and second of all, it's too useful to those activists. I mean, I you know, want to repeat, like, you know, I'm not against the idea of using social media as part of, as one tool in the toolkit. The problem that I've come to see is that it distracts people because they can assume that it's the only tool that they need. Yeah.
Is there anything that ended up on the cutting room floor in the editing stage that you'd like to tell us about?
Oh, there were so many. And I mean, I mentioned before that for each of those historical episodes, there was like 5 that I had to get rid of, and that I had spent a long time kind of researching. And I love the research stage of a book, like especially that historical part, because you just kind of allow yourself to get lost a bit. But, you know, I looked at radio in rural America in the 20s, like before radio became kind of consolidated and it was really a new medium. It actually was a little bit more like interactive and very, very local, you know. So I looked at how it had kind of helped build a sense of identity for people who were living in the middle of the country. You know, I looked at what were some of the other ones I looked at. Now, of course, now I'm like drawing a blank, but there were a lot of really I looked at sermons in the 18th century, before the American Revolution. Sermons played this really important role in that they would circulate amongst, you know, people would copy out and share, and that built to independence, or the spirit that would sort of lead to the American Revolution. That was sort of the thesis of that idea. There were a lot of really interesting ones. Some, you know, I spent more. Oh, you know, actually, this one I really loved was there was a in the 1980s, as AIDS was beginning to ravage the gay community, there was a kind of a phone tree, the Gay Men's Hotline, that became this fascinating source of not just actual information people needed to know, like what doctor will treat me, but you know, sympathy and community that kind of took place through the phone line. And so I was fascinated by the phone, the role that the phone served as a medium in that instance. In
supporting a kind of spontaneous mutual aid society.
Yeah, exactly.
That had to be created in the face of persecution or etc. A few final questions, Gal. This has been so great. I could go on for another hour. Do you have any recommendations for the best way to find and get involved in quietly radical spaces?
You know, I mean, that's pretty, but I think, you know, I think for me, the first thing I always say, and it's a little bit boring an answer, but local, you know, finding ways to express yourself politically, you know, or, you know, in terms of the causes that you care about locally. It's so often, I mean, you know, the Sewell, like our politics have become so nationalized, you know, that people, that, you know, that like even these local races, you know, where people are debating, you know, these much bigger national issues that don't actually affect the real lives of people, you know, in communities. And so I think that by virtue of, if you think, first of all, like what difference you can make at a very local level. And again, it's sort of a boring answer, but I think it is the answer for people who want to get involved and do more and kind of get out from behind the screen, is to really look at the different avenues of activism that you can have through your local city council, your local block, you know, to kind of improve life at the level at which people actually live it.
Well, I'm certainly heartened by that answer, not just for self-interested reasons, but, you know, one reason I am in Texas and really humbled and honored to do journalism here is that it is a different physical and mental space in some ways than the kind of a cellar corridor. You know, we know, you and I both know New York, LA, DC quite well, and they're all very special places, you know, full of interesting people and ideas, as is Boston, hub of the universe. But, you know, but they're in many ways very singular spaces. And there's so many other areas in which power in America is changing and playing out.
Yeah.
If we'd like to read more on these topics, and I guess I would define that as kind of social movements and, you know, digital, you know, versus, you know, analog kind of social movements, into like the spread of ideas, what suggestions do you have for places that for books to read other than your own?
For books to read, well, there's great kind of social movement histories. You know, two that just are just among my favorite books of all time are Taylor Branch is his series about it's a biography of Martin Luther King, but not really. It's really a biography of the movement.
And Parting the Waters is the first of the trilogy.
Parting the Waters is the first of a trilogy. I also really love the work of Adam Hochschild, who did King Leopold's Ghost. It's his most famous book, and it's a wonderful book also about a movement. But he has another book called Break the Chains, I think it's called, about abolition in England and sort of the birth of that. A book sort of that I took a lot of inspiration from as I was starting to work on mine was by Zeynep Tufekci, who's now a columnist at the Times, called Twitter and Tear Gas. If you're kind of interested in that dynamic of social media and social movements and the intersection of the two. But yeah, I mean, there's wonderful books about movements, and I think that there's a lot to learn. Yeah.
Gal, thank you so much for being so generous with your own insights. This is a really, really special book, and it's rare for me to encounter a set of characters and places I've never even heard of before. And the serendipity and the discovery that I felt, you know, reading this book were equally matched by, you know, the reflectiveness of your ideas and the depth of thought that went into them. Thank you so much for this hour.
Thank you, Sewell, for doing this. I
And
really
chat.
Thank you so much to both of you for being here tonight. We were so excited to do this event, and thank you to everybody who came out tonight and watched this with us and joined us this evening. And on behalf of Harvard Bookstore here in Massachusetts, keep reading and have a great evening. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye, Sally. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Gal.